"Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked across the quiet suburban street, and in that single moment, every porch light seemed to grow brighter while every neighbor suddenly found a reason to stop and watch. Naomi Brooks had just finished another 16-hour shift at St. Anne's Medical Center, and the exhaustion in her shoulders felt heavier than the canvas bag hanging from her arm. The late autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and fresh-cut grass, and a cool breeze rustled the American flag hanging from the porch of the small blue house she had spent 12 years slowly paying off. She had dreamed of this home ever since becoming a nurse, believing that a peaceful neighborhood and a white picket fence meant safety for her 12-year-old daughter. Tonight, that dream felt strangely distant. As Naomi reached into her purse for her house keys, flashing blue lights reflected across her driveway, turning the polished hood of her aging silver SUV into a sea of trembling color. Officer Daniel Mercer stepped out of his patrol vehicle with deliberate confidence, adjusting the radio clip to his shoulder before fixing his eyes on Naomi. His expression carried the certainty of a man who expected immediate obedience without explanation. "That vehicle yours?" he asked sharply. Naomi stopped moving. She kept both hands visible and answered with the calm voice she used every night with frightened patience. "Yes, officer. It's registered to me." Mercer glanced at the SUV, then back at Naomi as though her answer had only deepened his suspicion. "Mind telling me why a neighbor reported suspicious activity?" Naomi blinked once. "I just came home from work." She nodded toward the hospital identification badge still hanging around her neck. The laminated card swayed gently in the breeze, catching the glow from a nearby street lamp. Mercer barely looked at it. Instead, his gaze drifted over the quiet street where curtains shifted almost imperceptibly behind living room windows. A retired couple paused halfway through walking their golden retriever. Two teenagers stopped their bicycles near the corner. No one spoke. They simply watched. Naomi could feel dozens of unseen eyes measuring the moment before they knew the truth. She resisted the urge to sigh. She had learned long ago that frustration rarely changed first impressions. "License and registration," Mercer said. Naomi nodded politely. "Of course." She moved slowly, announcing every motion before making it, careful not to give anyone a reason to misunderstand. The silence between them became almost tangible, interrupted only by the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic chirping of crickets hidden beneath neatly trimmed hedges. Across the street, inside a modest brick home with a weathered wooden porch, a curtain shifted only an inch. A tall man stood perfectly still behind the glass, holding a steaming coffee mug that had long since stopped sending up steam. His eyes never left the scene unfolding beneath the streetlights. He did not step outside. He did not wave. He simply watched with the quiet patience of someone trained to notice details other people overlooked. Mercer remained focused on Naomi, unaware that every word, every gesture, and every decision he made was being witnessed by someone who understood exactly how quickly one ordinary evening could change a life forever. Naomi slowly removed her driver license from her wallet and handed it over without the slightest hint of irritation. Years of working overnight in an emergency room had taught her that calm was sometimes more powerful than explanation. She had comforted frightened children after car accidents, sat beside lonely veterans during their final hours, and held the hands of complete strangers when no family could arrive in time. Patience had become part of who she was long before she ever bought the little blue house on Maple Grove Lane. Every paycheck had been stretched with careful discipline. Every extra shift had gone toward the mortgage, her daughter Ava's school supplies, and the medication her elderly mother needed every month. There had been vacations she skipped and holidays spent working because someone else needed to be home with their family. None of those sacrifices had ever felt wasted whenever she watched Ava laughing on the front porch after school or watering the flower beds they planted together each spring. The neighborhood knew Naomi as the woman who shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' sidewalks before sunrise and quietly left homemade soup on porches whenever someone became sick. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker across the street still remembered the winter Naomi had driven her to the hospital during an ice storm when every ambulance was delayed. Mr. Hernandez often joked that Naomi smiled more before 7 in the morning than most people managed all week. Yet on this evening, those familiar faces remained silent behind windows and front yards, uncertain whether they should trust what they had witnessed for years or the authority standing beneath flashing lights. Officer Mercer studied Naomi's identification for several long seconds before speaking again. His eyes lingered on the hospital badge clipped neatly to her navy blue scrubs, but his expression never softened. Instead, he glanced toward the house, then back toward the silver sport utility vehicle parked perfectly inside the driveway. Everything appeared ordinary. The flower pots beside the porch steps were freshly watered. A bicycle rested near the garage door, decorated with bright purple handlebar streamers that clearly belonged to a child. Warm yellow light glowed through the kitchen curtains where a slow cooker still waited on the counter, filling the home with the comforting aroma of chicken stew Naomi had prepared before leaving for work the previous afternoon. She knew Ava would be waiting inside with homework spread across the dining room table, probably checking the clock every few minutes the way she always did whenever her mother worked overnight. Naomi resisted the urge to glance toward the front window because she did not want her daughter to feel frightened by what was happening outside. She simply folded her hands in front of her and waited. Across the street, the tall man behind the curtain continued watching without moving an inch. His steady gaze missed nothing, from the measured rhythm of Naomi's breathing to the tightening jaw of the officer standing beneath the blue lights. The coffee mug remained untouched in his hand as another patrol vehicle slowly turned onto the street before coming to a quiet stop several houses away, its headlights washing over the peaceful neighborhood like the opening scene of something far more significant than anyone standing there could yet understand. Officer Daniel Mercer handed Naomi's license back only after studying it far longer than necessary, his silence stretching across the street like a heavy fog. His posture remained rigid, his polished boots planted firmly on the pavement as though he had already decided how the evening would end. The second patrol vehicle remained parked near the corner, but its officers stayed inside, watching through the windshield without stepping into the conversation. Mercer slowly circled the front of Naomi's sport utility vehicle, running his eyes over every detail with deliberate precision. He looked at the registration sticker, the tires, the windshield, then back toward Naomi's modest home as though searching for something that refused to appear. His voice finally broke the quiet. "How long have you lived here?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Almost 12 years. Mercer raised an eyebrow. "That is a long time." His tone suggested he found the answer difficult to believe. Naomi simply nodded. She knew that arguing over implication instead of facts would solve nothing. The evening air continued to cool as porch lights illuminated one house after another. Mr. Hernandez shifted uneasily beside his mailbox before quietly walking his wife back toward their front porch. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind her lace curtains with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Everyone recognized Naomi. Everyone knew her routine. Yet the uniform standing beneath flashing lights carried an authority that made ordinary people hesitate before trusting what they already knew. Mercer glanced toward the neighboring homes and spoke loudly enough for nearby residents to hear. "We have received concerns about unusual activity in this area recently. I have to make sure everything checks out." Naomi noticed the careful wording. Nothing he said directly accused her, yet every sentence seemed to invite suspicion from those listening. She remained composed. "I understand you have responsibilities, officer. I only ask that we handle this respectfully." Mercer looked directly at her, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Respect, in his mind, appeared to mean unquestioned compliance rather than mutual dignity. He folded his arms and took one slow step closer without raising his voice. People who have nothing to hide usually answer questions faster. Naomi met his eyes with remarkable steadiness. People who spend their lives caring for others learn not to rush important conversations. For the first time that evening, Mercer seemed briefly unsettled, not because her words challenged his authority, but because they remained completely calm. There was no anger for him to respond to, no argument to escalate, no disrespect to point toward. Across the street, the man behind the window quietly placed his empty coffee mug on a wooden table beside the curtains. His attention never drifted from the scene outside. Years of disciplined observation had trained him to recognize small changes that others overlooked. He noticed Mercer's tightening shoulders, Naomi's measured breathing, the anxious expressions spreading across nearby porches, and the quiet officer still waiting inside the second patrol vehicle. Slowly, the man reached into his pocket, removed his cellular telephone, and unlocked the screen. He did not make a call. He simply held the phone in his hand, continuing to watch with calm, unwavering focus, as though waiting for one final decision before choosing whether to remain an unseen neighbor or become part of the story unfolding beneath the streetlights. Officer Mercer remained silent for several long seconds, studying Naomi with an expression that seemed determined to find doubt where none existed. The flashing lights painted shifting bands of blue across the quiet street, reflecting from mailbox posts, polished windows, and the chrome trim of parked cars. Naomi could hear nothing except the distant hum of a passing truck several blocks away and the faint ticking of her own cooling engine. She folded her hands loosely in front of her, refusing to match tension with tension. "Officer," she said gently, "if there is anything specific you believe needs to be verified, I am willing to cooperate within the law." Mercer took a slow breath before replying. "Step away from the vehicle and remain where you are until I finish my investigation." Naomi complied immediately, taking 2 measured steps backward onto the edge of her driveway. She never raised her voice, never argued, and never made a sudden movement. Her calm only deepened the uncomfortable silence surrounding them. Several neighbors had quietly gathered near their front porches, pretending to water plants or collect evening mail while carefully watching every moment unfold. Mrs. Whitaker lowered her teacup onto the porch railing with trembling hands. Mr. Hernandez removed his baseball cap and held it against his chest without realizing he had done so. They all knew Naomi. They all knew the woman standing beneath those flashing lights was the same neighbor who had cared for their families without asking for anything in return. Yet uncertainty lingered because uniforms carried weight, and ordinary people often struggled to question them. Mercer glanced toward the front door of Naomi's home once more. Through the narrow window beside the entrance, a warm hallway lamp glowed softly, casting long golden lines across the polished hardwood floor inside. Somewhere beyond that door, Ava was still waiting. Naomi imagined her daughter sitting quietly on the staircase exactly as she often did whenever she wanted to hear the front door open. That thought strengthened her resolve even further. She would not allow fear to become the lesson her daughter remembered from this night. Across the street, the quiet observer finally stepped down from his porch and walked slowly toward the sidewalk. His pace was unhurried, almost casual, but every movement reflected years of practiced discipline. He stopped well away from the patrol vehicles, careful not to interfere, and folded his hands behind his back. Officer Mercer noticed him for the first time. "Sir," Mercer called without taking his eyes off Naomi, "please remain where you are." The man nodded politely. "I have no intention of interfering, officer." His voice was calm, steady, and unexpectedly confident. There was nothing confrontational about it. It carried the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to remaining composed under pressure. Mercer gave a brief nod before turning his attention back toward Naomi, apparently dismissing the neighbor as another curious bystander. What Mercer did not realize was that the man had already observed every exchange from the very beginning, noting each word with remarkable precision. His eyes briefly shifted toward the small security camera mounted beneath Naomi's garage roof. A tiny green indicator light reflected beneath the eaves, confirming that the system had been recording continuously since Naomi's vehicle entered the driveway. The observer noticed it immediately. Mercer never looked up. For several long moments, no one spoke. The neighborhood seemed to pause along with them. The flashing patrol lights continued their slow rhythm across the quiet street, washing the maple trees in alternating shades of blue and white before fading into the darkness again. A light breeze drifted through the branches, carrying a handful of dry leaves across Naomi's driveway. They rolled gently over the concrete before settling beside the flower bed that she and Ava had planted together the previous spring. Naomi stood exactly where she had been asked to stand, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her eyes calm despite the uncertainty surrounding her. She thought about the countless patients she had comforted by reminding them to take one slow breath at a time. Now she quietly followed the same advice herself. Behind the front window, the silhouette of Ava appeared again for only a brief second before disappearing into the warm glow of the hallway. Naomi imagined her daughter pressing both hands against the curtain, trying to understand why her mother had not walked through the front door yet. That image weighed far more heavily on Naomi's heart than anything happening outside. Across the street, the quiet observer rested both hands lightly on the top of a white wooden fence, his expression unchanged. The years had taught him that silence often revealed more about people than arguments ever could. He watched Officer Mercer carefully. He noticed the officer repeatedly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing toward the gathered neighbors before returning his attention to Naomi. He also noticed something else. Every nearby home now seemed awake. Porch lights that had been dark only minutes earlier now glowed warmly across the block. Curtains had opened. Front doors stood slightly ajar. People were no longer pretending not to notice. They were watching because something about the evening no longer felt ordinary. The second patrol officer remained seated inside the vehicle at the corner, observing quietly without interrupting. The atmosphere felt strangely suspended, as though everyone sensed an invisible line had been reached. Naomi closed her eyes for only a heartbeat before opening them again. She refused to allow frustration to replace dignity. Her mother had once told her that character was easiest to recognize when no one expected kindness anymore. Those words returned now with remarkable clarity. Officer Mercer finally looked up toward the surrounding homes. Dozens of eyes met his without a single word being spoken. The observer slowly removed his cellular telephone from his jacket pocket once more. This time he did not simply hold it. He glanced briefly at the screen, checked the time, then quietly pressed a single contact that had remained near the top of his list for years. He raised the telephone to his ear but waited without speaking, his attention never leaving the driveway. Somewhere in the distance, the faint ringing connected. He listened for only a second before saying in a calm, measured voice, "I may need you to document something. I will explain in a moment." He ended the call almost immediately, slipped the telephone back into his pocket, and returned to complete silence. Officer Mercer never realized the call had been made. His attention remained fixed entirely on Naomi, unaware that the quiet stillness surrounding the neighborhood was no longer empty. It had become the calm that often arrives just before the truth finally steps into the light. The quiet finally broke when the observer took one measured step away from the fence and walked toward the edge of the sidewalk, careful to leave several yards between himself and the patrol vehicle. His calm presence drew Officer Mercer's attention immediately. "Sir, this is an active police matter," Mercer said firmly. "Please remain where you are." The man nodded respectfully. "I intend to do exactly that, officer." His voice carried neither challenge nor hesitation. It was the steady tone of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking only after thinking first. Naomi glanced toward him for the first time that evening. She recognized him only as the quiet neighbor who had moved into the brick house a few months earlier. They had exchanged polite greetings while collecting mail, nothing more. Mercer looked briefly irritated that another witness had chosen to step into view. "Did you see something?" he asked. "I did," the man answered simply. "I have been observing this interaction from the moment Ms. Brooks arrived home." Mercer folded his arms. "Then you know I am conducting a lawful investigation." "I know you have conducted an extended interaction," the man replied evenly. I also know every minute of it has been recorded. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. Recorded? The man pointed calmly toward the small security camera mounted beneath Naomi's garage roof. Her home security system has been facing this driveway the entire time. Before Mercer could respond, the observer reached into his jacket and removed a slim leather wallet. He opened it just enough for Mercer to see an official identification card before closing it again. "My name is Marcus Hayes," he said. "I served 24 years as a Navy SEAL before retiring. These days I assist several law enforcement agencies as an instructor in leadership, ethics, and professional decision-making." The words settled over the neighborhood with remarkable stillness. Even the second officer inside the patrol vehicle looked up sharply from behind the windshield. Marcus continued without changing his calm expression. "I am not here to interfere with your duties, officer. I am here because I happened to witness this encounter from beginning to end." Mercer remained silent for the first time since arriving. Marcus looked toward Naomi with quiet respect before returning his attention to Mercer. "Miss Brooks has remained cooperative, respectful, and patient throughout this entire conversation. She has answered your questions, followed your instructions, and conducted herself with remarkable professionalism." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, uncomfortable being discussed rather than speaking for herself. Marcus noticed that as well. "The camera attached to her home will provide an objective record," he continued. "My own exterior security system also overlooks this section of the street. Between those recordings and the witnesses gathered here, there will be a complete timeline of what occurred this evening." The words were not spoken as a threat. They sounded like a simple statement of fact. Around the neighborhood, several porch lights seemed brighter than before as neighbors slowly stepped into the open instead of remaining hidden behind curtains. Mrs. Whitaker quietly placed a reassuring hand on Mr. Hernandez's shoulder. The second patrol officer finally opened his vehicle door and stood beside it, listening carefully. For the first time that evening, Officer Mercer realized he was no longer the only person evaluating what had happened beneath the flashing lights. The weight of the moment settled over the neighborhood with surprising gentleness. Officer Mercer slowly lowered his shoulders, the certainty that had defined his posture only minutes earlier giving way to thoughtful silence. The blue emergency lights still reflected across Naomi's driveway, but somehow they no longer felt overwhelming. Marcus Hayes remained exactly where he stood, offering neither accusation nor triumph. His calm presence left little room for defensiveness because he had spoken only about facts. Naomi looked from Marcus to Officer Mercer before quietly breaking the silence herself. "Officer," she said softly, "I know your job is difficult. Every day I work with people during the hardest moments of their lives. I believe most people want to do the right thing, even when situations become complicated." Several neighbors exchanged surprised glances. They had expected anger, perhaps even demands for an apology. Instead, Naomi's voice carried the same quiet compassion that had comforted countless patients through long nights at the hospital. Mercer looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. His tone was noticeably different now. "Ms. Brooks, I appreciate your cooperation." The words sounded careful, almost reflective, as though he were reconsidering every decision that had brought them to this point. Naomi gave a small nod. "Thank you, officer." Marcus watched the exchange without interruption. Experience had taught him that genuine accountability could never be forced. It had to begin with the willingness to see another person clearly. The second patrol officer quietly approached, stopping beside Mercer with respectful professionalism. He spoke in a low voice that only those nearby could hear. Mercer listened carefully, then glanced toward the security camera mounted beneath Naomi's garage before looking across the street at the growing number of neighbors. It had become impossible to ignore what the evening had revealed. Every person standing there knew Naomi not as a stranger but as the nurse who checked on elderly residents during snowstorms, organized canned food drives before Thanksgiving, and never hesitated to help someone in need. Her reputation had not been built in a single evening. It had been earned over years of consistent kindness. Mercer slowly exhaled. "You should be able to go inside and be with your daughter," he said. Naomi smiled with quiet relief. "She has probably been worried." Mercer nodded once. "I imagine she has." As Naomi turned toward her front porch, she paused and looked back. "I hope the rest of your shift is safe, officer." The simple sincerity of those words caught everyone by surprise. There was no trace of sarcasm, no bitterness, only genuine concern for another human being. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. He had witnessed courage many times throughout his military career, but moments like this reminded him that true strength rarely announced itself with loud voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it appeared as a tired nurse choosing dignity instead of resentment after one of the longest days of her life. Around them, neighbors slowly began returning to their homes. Mrs. Whitaker lifted one hand in a gentle wave toward Naomi. Mr. Hernandez smiled quietly beneath the porch light. The tension that had gripped the street dissolved almost as naturally as the evening breeze moving through the maple trees. Yet everyone present understood that something far more meaningful than an ordinary police encounter had unfolded. They had witnessed the quiet power of character, and once seen, it could never be forgotten. 3 months passed, and winter quietly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring. Fresh green leaves returned to the maple trees lining Maple Grove Lane, and colorful flowers once again bloomed beneath Naomi's front porch exactly where she and Ava had planted them together the year before. Life had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Naomi continued working long overnight shifts at the hospital, greeting every patient with the same reassuring smile that had become her signature. Every afternoon she still returned home carrying a worn canvas bag, still waved to neighbors while checking her mailbox, and still found time to help anyone who needed an extra hand. Some things never changed because kindness was not something she performed. It was simply who she was. One Saturday morning the neighborhood gathered for its annual community picnic at the small park just 2 blocks away. Children laughed as they chased one another across the open field while families shared homemade food beneath rows of white tents. Ava proudly helped distribute donated books to younger children, smiling every time someone thanked her mother for organizing another successful community event. Nearby, Marcus Hayes sat quietly beneath the shade of a large oak tree, speaking with several local veterans who had come to volunteer. As always, he listened more than he talked. His greatest satisfaction came not from being recognized but from watching ordinary people care for one another. Shortly before noon, another familiar face walked across the grass. Officer Daniel Mercer approached without the confidence that had once defined his stride. He was no longer surrounded by flashing lights or the authority of a tense moment. He was simply another member of the community attending a neighborhood gathering. When he reached Naomi, he stopped for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Brooks," he said sincerely, "I wanted to thank you." Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. Mercer continued, "That evening gave me an opportunity to reflect on the responsibility that comes with wearing a badge. I have spent the last several months participating in additional professional training and listening more carefully than I ever had before. I appreciate the grace you showed when it would have been easier to answer with anger." Naomi smiled warmly. Growth begins when people are willing to listen. That is true in hospitals, in neighborhoods, and everywhere else. Mercer nodded, grateful for the simple wisdom in her words. Marcus watched the brief conversation from across the park before returning his attention to the children playing nearby. He knew the strongest victories rarely ended with applause. They ended with understanding. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the neighborhood, Ava slipped her hand into her mother's. Together they began the short walk home beneath rows of gently swaying trees. The breeze carried the laughter of children through the warm spring air while golden light reflected across the quiet street where everything had begun months before. The houses looked exactly the same, yet something invisible had changed forever. The neighbors no longer remembered that evening because of flashing lights or uncomfortable silence. They remembered it because one woman had chosen dignity over bitterness, compassion over resentment, and quiet strength over pride. Long after every conversation faded, that was the story the neighborhood continued telling, and it became a reminder that the strongest people are often the ones who never need to raise their voices for the truth to be heard.